The central hearing chamber of the Galactic Council stood above the blue-white curve of Iridian Prime, the administrative world where treaties were written and smaller nations could disappear inside footnotes. Saren Vale crossed the final security bridge with 2 Earth clerks behind her and a single case slate in her hand. She was 46 years old and served as Earth's senior legal envoy for boundary disputes. She had been sent there for one purpose: to stop Earth from being crushed in public before the hearing had even reached its middle. This was not a routine review. Earth had crossed into a protected relocation corridor during a council operation and pulled civilians out. The charge against Earth was simple enough for any listener to follow. Earth had breached the line. If Saren failed here, Earth would not just be censured. It could be placed under outside legal control for future interventions, and the people Earth had tried to save could still vanish in law. Across the chamber, the other side had arrived in full strength. Director Salvek of the Council Legal Order sat at the lower prosecution tier, flanked by procedural advisors from the old charter blocks. Behind him, elevated in a ring of pale light, sat the voting delegates of the council. Some came from powers with fleets older than human rocketry. Others represented trade syndicates so vast they could starve a colony by delaying repair parts for 1 month. Saren did not mistake formality for fairness. She had spent enough years in treaty halls to know the difference between due process and a ceremonial execution. The chamber had been designed to make every speaker feel exposed and every defendant feel temporary. Even the air in the room seemed arranged to remind smaller worlds that they were guests inside someone else's structure. An attendant voice rolled across the space and asked all parties to identify themselves for the public record. Saren stepped into the witness circle and placed her hand on the verification rail. I am Saren Vale, senior legal envoy of the Earth Accord delegation. Her voice carried farther than she expected. That was deliberate. The hall had been built so truth and humiliation used the same acoustics. Director Salvek rose next. He was narrow, silver-skinned, and utterly controlled, with the kind of face that made every sentence sound as if it had already survived appeal. I appear for the Council Legal Order in the matter of unlawful cross-boundary intervention by the Earth Accord inside a protected administrative transition zone. Saren heard the phrasing and filed it away. Administrative transition zone was the polished term, much cleaner than the truth. It was a populated region in the middle of evacuation where an entire people had been downgraded on paper so they could be moved, counted, and absorbed without triggering full treaty protection. That was the real center of the case, no matter how carefully the chamber tried to polish it. The presiding moderator called the hearing to order. 3 lights ignited above the chamber floor, 1 for the council, 1 for Earth, and 1 for public broadcast. That third light mattered most. Saren looked once toward the upper gallery, where foreign observers, journalists, and neutral delegations watched from behind transparent barriers. This was not a quiet legal review. It was a public lesson, and someone wanted the galaxy to see Earth restrained. The moderator spoke with ritual calm. The council will hear the complaint that vessels operating under Earth authority entered a controlled evacuation corridor surrounding the Aston Reach relocation belt, transmitted unauthorized civil recognition protocols, extracted registered persons from an active jurisdictional transfer, and interfered with a council-managed resettlement sequence. Director Salvek, proceed. Salvek inclined his head. The facts are straightforward. Earth vessels crossed into an area under temporary jurisdictional transition. Earth personnel inserted civil identity teams into a transfer corridor. Earth Command transmitted recognition codes that contradicted standing classification orders, and Earth escorts then removed affected persons from lawful administrative custody. He paused just long enough for the charge to settle into the room. Then he translated it into simpler language for the public feed. In plain terms, Earth trespassed, disrupted a regulated process, and illegally seized a population already assigned under council authority. Murmurs moved through the observer tiers. Saren could almost feel the simplified story taking shape across 1,000 feeds. Impulsiva humans. Moral theater. Dangerous precedent. Salvek turned toward her. Envoy Vale, Will Earth deny these acts? This was where weak delegations usually made their first mistake. They tried to dodge the frame entirely and looked evasive before they had even begun. Saren had no intention of doing that. Earth will not deny that it crossed the boundary line, she said. The chamber changed in an instant. Several delegates leaned forward, and a few observers looked at one another in surprise. One of the Earth clerks behind Saren inhaled sharply enough for the chamber microphones to catch it. Salvek did not smile, but a faint release passed through his shoulders. So Earth concedes the primary violation. Earth concedes procedural breach, Saren said. Not unlawful purpose. The moderator lifted a hand. You may explain. Saren let 2 seconds pass, not for drama, but for order. People listening by audio needed the path laid cleanly. Earth crossed the boundary because the process under council protection was being used to erase the legal existence of a civilian population during evacuation. If we had waited for normal review, there would have been no recognized people left to review. A sharper reaction spread this time. Not noise, but compression, the sound of hundreds of listeners adjusting to a larger claim. Salvek answered before anyone else could. He wanted the chamber to snap back into the narrow frame of simple trespass. A spectacular accusation. One unsupported by the certified record. That depends which record was certified, Saren said. The moderator intervened again. Envoy Vale. The present question is whether Earth violated covenant procedure. If you seek to challenge the underlying administrative action, you must establish relevance. Saren met the moderator's gaze. The woman came from a neutral maritime civilization and had built her career on appearing balanced while preserving institutional stability. She was one of the undecided powers Earth needed, and Saren knew it. The relevance is direct, she said. Earth breached a line to stop a misuse of council law that would have stripped millions of people of recognized identity while they were already displaced and unable to contest classification. That is not the matter before us, Salvek said. It became the matter when you used the law to make witnesses disappear on paper. Now, there was open motion in the gallery. Not chaos, but real disturbance. A few delegates turned to one another. The chamber no longer felt still. Salvek looked toward the moderator, asking the chamber to discipline tone without saying it aloud. The moderator struck the rail once. Order. The council will hear grounded submissions. Nothing more. Saren bowed her head by a fraction. She had no need to shout because the point had landed. The hearing was no longer a neat trespass case. The question hanging in the chamber was one ordinary listener could now understand. What had Earth actually interrupted? Salvek changed tactic at once. He needed to make the council side sound like order itself. Then let us stay with facts. The Aston Reach population in question was under lawful transition from protected civic status to dependent labor administration under emergency resettlement protocols. That transition was authorized under existing charter provisions. Saren heard several delegates relax at the word lawful, as if legality itself could stand in for morality and evidence both. Salvek continued in the same controlled tone. Earth had no standing to countermand that status change. Earth had no authority to issue recognition signals in defiance of council coding. Earth had no right to remove assigned persons from that corridor. He turned toward the council ring. If newer powers are permitted to breach law whenever they disagree with lawful classification, then no interstellar order remains. That was his frame, and it was powerful. Not cruelty, not conquest, stability. Saren waited until the moderator nodded to her. The council should hear one correction before this narrative hardens, she said. The people removed by Earth were not taken from normal custody. They were in the middle of an identity downgrade at the exact hour they were least able to object, while their communication networks had already been routed through transition filters and their local archives were being rewritten. Salvek spoke over her. Again, accusation without proof. Saren lifted the case slate in her hand. I brought proof. I also brought time sequence certifications, transfer logs, and witness chains from neutral observers who saw when the status shifts were executed. If the council intends to judge Earth in public, Then the public should hear what Earth was interrupting. The moderator studied her for a long moment. Director Salvek has requested summary disposition. Do you oppose? Edo. On what basis? On the basis that a ruling against Earth now would validate the exact mechanism that made the affected population legally invisible. The words settled heavily into the chamber. Salvek rose at once. The council need not detour into grandstanding. Earth admits procedural violation. The rest is political cover. Saren turned slightly toward him, enough for the microphones to carry both voices cleanly. If it were cover, Director, you would not be trying this hard to keep the sequence hidden. For the first time, his expression changed. Not much, but enough. The moderator looked from one to the other, then addressed the chamber. Summary disposition is denied for the present. The hearing will proceed. Director Salvek may lay out the certified record. Envoy Vale will then be allowed response on relevance and underlying process. The light over Earth dimmed and rose again. It was not acquittal and not safety, but it was time. Saren let out one slow breath. The first objective had been small and brutal. Not to win, not to persuade, only to survive the opening without letting the chamber lock the whole case into one sentence. She had done that, but she also knew the harder truth waiting underneath it. Once the record began, the second trap would close. The law itself would be presented as settled, and everything Earth had done would look more reckless with every page turned. If she wanted to reverse that, she would have to show not merely that the council had made a mistake. She would have to show that the machine had been built to do this. Salvek began with maps. The chamber floor shifted and threw a rotating projection into the air above them. The Aston Reach spread across the room as a braided corridor of stations, transport lanes, shelter arcs, and flag sectors lit in procedural colors. Yellow marked evacuation, blue marked civil review, red marked restricted movement, white marked protected archive routes, and a violet band marked the corridor Earth had crossed. Salvek pointed to it with a measured gesture. At the time of violation, the Aston Reach relocation belt was under coordinated emergency management following infrastructure collapse across its inner settlements. Transit rights had been temporarily centralized to prevent seizure, panic scattering, and predatory claims by local militias. He moved the display forward in time. The population cluster at issue had been designated for dependent labor administration due to inability to maintain self-sufficient governance during transit. Saren watched the label appear above millions of biosigns. There was no screaming, no chains, and no dramatic image for a public feed. There was only terminology that made dispossession sound like maintenance. Around the upper ring, a few delegates sat back as if the case were settling into familiar grooves. Salvek continued. The Earth Accord was notified of this status. The Earth Accord filed no successful challenge. Instead, Earth inserted vessels into the corridor, deployed identity specialists, transmitted contradictory recognition codes to shelters and escort ships, and removed assigned persons beyond council custody. He called up visual records from the day in question. Human rescue ships cut through the edge of the restricted band under emergency burn. Portable beacons from Earth teams flashed recognition strings at transfer nodes. Shuttle doors opened to lines of exhausted evacuees. The angle of the footage made Earth look invasive, sudden, and defiant. Saren understood at once what the room was meant to feel. A delegate from the Trade Quorum spoke next. The Trade Quorum represented major transport and supply interests, and they cared first about precedent. How many did Earth remove? Salvek answered without turning. Verified removal count stands at 38,412, with probable related displacement well above that number. Another delegate asked the question Saren had expected. Were these persons already marked for reassignment under charter authority? Yes, there it was. It was simple enough to travel across every channel in the galaxy. Earth entered a controlled zone and took nearly 40,000 reassigned persons out of lawful custody. If Saren did not rebuild the context, the rest of the hearing was already lost. Salvek brought up the certified order itself. Emergency Resettlement Addendum 17. During active transfer conditions, a population lacking recognized autonomous continuity may be reclassified for dependent administration when the preservation of wider regional stability requires it. He let the text hang over the chamber. Many in the audience would hear only two words, recognized and stability. Those are the words power used when it wanted applause from people too far away to smell what had burned. Salvek turned to Saren again. Envoy Vale, would you care to confirm that Earth received this addendum before the breach? Yes. And that Earth had not secured an injunction against its application? Yes. And that Earth nevertheless crossed the line? Yes. He inclined his head to the moderator, as if the case had politely finished itself. Saren spoke before that impression could settle. The council should now hear what that addendum does in practice. The moderator gestured for her to proceed. Saren stepped closer to the witness rail and sent her own records into the chamber. The maps did not disappear. She overlaid them with timestamps, message delays, and identity cascade charts. Please hold the corridor image in view, she said. Listeners need the geography. That was not theater. It was clarity. By audio. And by screen, people have to know where the action, as if the sacrifice had already been regretted properly, which in his mind made it reasonable. Saren did not push emotion. She pushed timing. Please display Earth sequence file 4. A new chart appeared beside the addendum. It showed certified order time, transfer queue surge, archive interruption, communications rerouting, and the first Earth alert. Earth's position is narrow and factual, Saren said. The Sylith were reclassified at the moment they were least able to contest reclassification. Their local archives were fragmented. Their council nodes were separated. Their recognition paths were controlled by the same administrative structure carrying out the downgrade. Once the shift completed, any appeal would be filed by a population that no longer legally existed as a people. A heavy silence followed. Even the observer tiers grew still. Salvek answered more sharply this time. Earth is recasting routine emergency administration as conspiracy. Saren kept her eyes on the moderator. No, Earth is saying the procedure was used at the one moment when challenge became functionally impossible. The moderator leaned forward. Do you allege intentional misuse by the council legal order? I allege that the procedure creates a path for misuse so clean that intent barely matters once activated. That line moved through the public tiers almost audibly. Saren had built it for that purpose, because listeners needed one sentence they could hold. Salvek requested permission to question directly, and the moderator granted it. He faced Saren without overt hostility. That made him more dangerous. Envoy Vale, do you dispute that the Sylith infrastructure had collapsed beyond self-administration? I dispute that collapse justified eliminating their right to remain a people. Do you dispute that surrounding claimants were preparing to partition the belt? No. Then do you accept that rapid central management was required? Rapid management, yes. Permanent erasure by status change, no. Salvek spread one hand slightly. There it is. Earth did not object to emergency action. Earth objected to lawful classification policy. Yet instead of using review channels, Earth chose unilateral intervention. That is not principled restraint. That is power politics dressed in rescue language. Several delegates signaled assent. Saren saw the next trap clearly. If she argued only morality, she would look naive. If she argued only legal detail, she would drown. She needed the next layer. Then let us discuss review channels, she said. She called up the challenge filings Earth had submitted before the breach. All were stamped received, and all had been routed into deferred urgency queues. We filed. Repeatedly. The first challenge was delayed for lack of archive coherence. The second was delayed because the affected population no longer met the threshold for direct standing after reclassification. The third was delayed pending confirmation from the same transit office executing the transfer. By the time review could occur, the Sylith would have ceased to exist in law as a distinct collectivity. The chamber quieted in a different way now. There was less performance and more arithmetic. A few delegates exchanged low remarks. Above them, the public light glowed without flicker. A trade delegate objected. That may show bureaucratic lag, not abuse. Sarah nodded. It may, but lag becomes a weapon when the clock itself destroys the claimant. Salvek cut in, and Earth decided that only Earth could judge this. No, Saren said. Earth decided that waiting would complete the act. The moderator finally gave the ruling both sides had anticipated. The Council will continue hearing evidence on the underlying process before entertaining summary judgment. Time again. Small, precious, and still not safety. A recess was called for system verification. Delegates rose, observers shifted, and the public light dimmed, but did not fully die. The hearing would resume in 30 standard minutes. As people moved, the room seemed to breathe for the first time. Saren stepped away from the rail, and her chief clerk, Leanne Mercer, moved beside her at once. They are rattled, he said quietly. They are adjusting, Saren replied. That is different. He handed her a cross-linked digest of external reactions from the public feeds. Earth audiences were already splitting into familiar camps. One called her reckless for admitting breach. Another called her brave for saying what the Council had done. Most of the galaxy still saw a simpler picture. Humans broke the line and then tried to moralize the consequences. Any movement from the neutral blocks? She asked. Minor. Meridian is uneasy. River Senate wants more data. 2 shipping delegates have requested archive suppression on commercial grounds. Saren almost laughed. Commercial grounds had probably done more damage in galactic history than open malice. She and Leanne moved into the side corridor assigned to Earth. Security fields shimmered behind them, and Iridian Prime's distant curve showed through the station glass, smooth, blue, and indifferent. Leanne lowered his voice. You think Salvek knows. How far back this goes? He knows enough to protect the mechanism, Saren said. Whether he built it is a separate question. He handed her another slate. It contained the comparative charter revisions her archive team had reconstructed during transit. Saren scanned the highlighted sequence. There was not one change, but many. Small edits across 20 years. Each one reasonable in isolation. Each one narrowed the conditions under which a displaced people could still claim continuity. Each one expanded emergency authority in the name of stable transit and regional order. Not sloppy law. Engineered law. Leanne watched her face. It is worse than we thought. Yes. The pattern is clean enough to show intent. No, Saren said. Clean enough to show design. Intent will be disputed. Design is harder to escape. He understood the distinction and nodded. What about the witness line? Saren looked back through the transparent wall toward the chamber, where aides were resetting displays and checking transmission bands. We do not go to witnesses first. If we make this emotional too early, they will call it sentimental manipulation. We show structure, beneficiaries, and revision sequence. Then witnesses become confirmation, not foundation. Leanne hesitated. And when they ask whether Earth knowingly violated the covenant, Saren answered without delay, I will say yes. He studied her, as if hoping she might finally choose the safer lie. That may cost us the ruling. It may save the part that matters. Leanne looked down at the slates in his hands. There are people on Earth who will hate that. There are people on Earth who like clean victories. I was not sent here for one. The recess clock continued its silent descent on the corridor wall. Around them, Council aides moved quickly with sealed packets and whispered instructions. No one looked panicked. Real power rarely did. It simply reallocated. Saren returned to the chamber before the others did and stood again in the witness circle while the lighting recalibrated. For a moment the room was almost empty. There was only her, the ring of seats, and the records hovering above the floor. This was the true shape of the struggle, she thought. Not fleets and not slogans. It was one civilization trying to keep another civilization from being pushed out of existence through disciplined language and orderly signatures. When the delegates came back in, the chamber filled with purpose again. The moderator called them to resumption. Envoy Vale, you have argued that the process Earth interrupted was susceptible to misuse. The Council will now hear whether that process reflects ordinary emergency law or a broader pattern. Saren placed both hands lightly on the rail. then the council should begin 20 years earlier. She called up the revision chain as a vertical stream of law, dates, subsections, emergency supplements, transit harmonization notes, archive integrity exceptions, and review threshold adjustments. Each amendment seemed minor alone. Together, they formed a narrowing tunnel. Addendum 17 did not appear out of necessity, fully formed, Saren said. It was assembled piece by piece through a series of revisions attached to shipping stability law, relocation management law, and post-collapse labor allocation law. A delegate from the Western Resource Combined frowned. That bloc represented extraction interests and had no patience for arguments that threatened efficient corridor control. That is ordinary charter evolution. Sometimes, Saren said. But ordinary evolution does not consistently move in one direction at the expense of the same category of populations. She highlighted the first revision. Revision 1 lowered the archive coherence threshold required for emergency downgrades. The second lit beneath it. Revision 2 permitted continuity review to proceed without full council assembly of the affected people. The third followed. Revision 3 moved appeals during active transfer into deferred urgency queues. Then the fourth. Revision 4 allowed transition authorities to treat fragmented communication as evidence of failing autonomous continuity. She let the stream continue rising. Each step made it easier to say a displaced people no longer met the conditions to remain a people. Each step also moved challenge further away from the moment of harm. Salvek answered from the prosecution tier. Each step responded to real crises across unstable corridors. You are flattening decades of emergency practice in a sinister intent. I'm identifying a legal architecture, Saren said. If you dislike the shape, that is not because I built it. The moderator signaled for restraint before either voice sharpened. A data analyst from the Neutral Audit Office, summoned for verification, stepped into a sidewell. The analyst confirmed the revision chain as authentic and chronologically accurate. That alone did not prove corruption. It proved something more durable. The mechanism existed. Saren pushed one layer deeper. Now the council should see where these revisions were most often applied. A field of stars spread across the chamber and resolved into census zones. Bright concentrations marked regions where emergency downgrades had been executed over the last 2 decades. Nearly all sat along transport corridors, extraction belts, or repair chains valuable to long-range commerce. No one in the chamber needed her to explain what that meant. She did anyway because people listening by ear needed the line. The procedure is used disproportionately on populations living across routes other powers depend on. A delegate from the old charter bloc lifted one hand. Correlation is not exploitation. Fragile populations often occupy fragile routes. Saren nodded. True. So let us test the next question. Who benefits after reclassification? New records unfolded. Contract transfers, labor allotment adjustments, cargo security reassignments, long-term maintenance rights, and emergency custodial leases that had somehow lasted years. Now, the pattern no longer looked accidental. The communities most often downgraded lose collective standing. The surrounding commercial or administrative blocks gain direct access to their labor pools, stations, transit rights, or land use. The beneficiaries are not identical in every case, but they come from the same narrow band of established interests. Salvek requested immediate challenge, and the moderator allowed it. He stood under the council light with the poise of someone who had spent a lifetime converting moral discomfort into procedural patience. Envoy Vale is presenting lawful downstream allocation as if it were proof of design. When any local governance fails, someone must maintain the corridor. Someone must operate life support, food flow, traffic control, and structural repair. The council cannot preserve entire regions by sentiment. Saren answered without heat. No one asked it to. Then what are you asking? I'm asking whether the law was written to preserve corridors or to make people easier to absorb when preservation becomes expensive. Salvek spread both hands slightly. A false choice. It becomes true when the same populations repeatedly lose legal identity at the exact moment valuable routes come under strain. The moderator interjected. The chamber will avoid argument by slogan. Director Salvek, respond on mechanism. He did. The mechanism exists because interstellar collapse is messy. Populations fragment. Local archive fail. Lines of authority vanish. If emergency law could not compress governance under those conditions, entire sectors would die. Saren did not dispute the premise. She stepped beside it. Emergency consolidation is not the issue. Permanently downgrading a people while the evidence of their continuity is still scattered in. Transit is. A delegate from the Meridian clusters asked for clarification. Distinguish those two, for the record. Saren turned toward the delegate. In one case, outside management preserves function until review can reconstruct civic continuity. In the other, outside management uses the period of dislocation to conclude continuity is gone and need not be restored. The delegate's expression tightened. And your claim is that the second is happening. Yes. Salvek answered first. Our claim is that some communities do not return from collapse as coherent political bodies and should not be romanticized into one. Saren heard the quiet strength in his wording and respected it even as she opposed it. He was not wrong that some systems failed past repair. That was why his broader argument sounded reasonable. A useful eye always rested on true pressure. She changed the chamber's angle of view again. Then let us speak specifically about the sci-fi. Profiles of habitat rings, maintenance farms, freight stations, and community council registries open one by one. The sci-fi were not glamorous. They were technicians, growers, insulation crews, docking families, archive keepers, weld teams, transport nurses, and people who made bad routes survivable. The sci-fi had functioning civic continuity before the corridor collapse, Saren said. Their records show stable local representation, shared archive practices, and recognized collective identity across 6 major habitat clusters. Their weakness was not absence of continuity. Their weakness was dependence on infrastructure they did not control. That line traveled farther than any statistic. In the observer gallery, one row of delegates who had looked bored at the start of the session now watched without whispering. A delegate from the resource combine tried another angle. Even if everything you say is true, Earth still had no standing to intervene by force. Saren met the challenge. Earth did not enter by force against civilian populations. Earth entered a restricted corridor after repeated review failure, transmitted civil recognition codes to preserve identity logs, and evacuated persons at immediate risk of disappearing from legal record. That is a polished way to describe seizure. No. Seizure transfers ownership. Recognition prevents erasure. Before the exchange could spiral, the moderator called for witness file review from the audit office. Verified logs were projected into the air. Time-stamped rerouting orders, delayed appeals, classification activations, and civil registry failures appeared one after another. The chamber began seeing what Saren had seen on the transport. Out from Earth. It was not enough for a conviction against the Council's old guard. It was enough to make innocence impossible. That was when the second layer stepped forward, not physically but politically. A representative of the Hadran Transit Compact requested speaking privilege from the upper ring. The Hadrans were not a government in the old sense. They were a commercial sovereignty, a network of shipyards, bonded corridors, insurance pools, and route maintenance contracts. Their interest was simple. Keep critical lanes moving and profitable. Permission was granted. The Hadran speaker appeared as a tall figure in blue formal mesh with the insignia of route stewardship on one shoulder. The Transit Compact rejects the implication that corridor interests designed these revisions for exploitative ends. We supported reform because uncontrolled collapse along freight arteries causes mass death far beyond local communities. Saren inclined her head. No one disputes the danger of corridor collapse. Then your framing is reckless. If every population in distress can insist on full sovereignty restoration before routes stabilize, then rescue lanes fail and other worlds suffer. There was the deeper antagonist, not one prosecutor, but a whole alliance that believed efficiency and survival justified, giving fragile peoples fewer chances to remain themselves. Saren answered carefully. The choice is not between full sovereignty restoration and total emergency control. The choice is whether emergency control must include permanent legal reduction while the affected people are least able to resist. The Hadran speaker did not retreat. Some populations cannot be restored as they were. Then prove that after review, Saren said. Not during dislocation. Another request to speak came at once, this time from the Oronine Extraction League, which held mining and repair rights across multiple frontier belts. The Oronine bloc represented direct material gain. Their speaker's tone was even colder. If Envoy Vale wishes to challenge the legal foundation of dependent administration, she should say so plainly. The galaxy cannot function if every attached labor civilization is treated as an untouchable sovereign in times of system failure. There was the sentence, attached labor civilization. Saren did not respond immediately, because the public needed to hear the ugliness cleanly. What the galaxy cannot survive, she said at last, is the habit of deciding that a people becomes less real when stronger neighbors need uninterrupted output. The chamber tightened. The moderator allowed no applause and no outbursts, but the silence. That followed was heavier than either. Salvek, re-entered before the moment, turned against him fully. The council is drifting. We are not trying an entire economic order. Your economic order is why the breach mattered, Saren said. He looked straight at her. And now we arrive at Earth's actual posture. Not legal argument, but political grandstanding against the structures that keep interstellar civilization alive. Saren did not blink. If interstellar civilization stays alive by waiting for displaced peoples to lose the paperwork required to remain peoples, then yes. Earth objects. The moderator cut across them both. The chamber will pause broad argument. We will return to the incident itself. Director Salvek, proceed to direct evidence concerning Earth's extraction actions. He seized the opening. New footage filled the hall. This time the chamber saw not route maps and statutes, but body-level recordings from the transfer corridor. Human teams moved through smoke haze and low lighting. Portable translators called names. Security officers from council transport units shouted conflicting instructions. Shelter doors stood half open. Families clustered around recognition beacons. Salvek slowed one clip until the image froze on an Earth officer waving civilians toward a departing shuttle. Earth personnel issued contradictory authority cues inside a live transfer channel. Do you deny this? No. Earth escorts overrode local movement control. Yes. Earth teams removed persons already logged for dependent administration. Yes. Each answer hit the room like a separate stone. Saren did not soften them, because denial would kill the case now. Behind the transparent barriers, a low wave of message traffic rolled across the galleries. Salvek leaned into the obvious. Then let us discard all fog. Earth knowingly broke covenant, knowingly disrupted legal authority, and knowingly removed assigned populations from council management. Saren waited for the moderator's signal, then answered. Yes, Earth did all those things. This time the chamber reacted openly. Several delegates spoke at once, and one observer tier flared with message traffic. Even Leanne behind her shifted in alarm, though he had known this answer was coming. The moderator demanded order. When quiet returned, Salvek spoke almost softly. Then why are we still here? Saren faced the chamber, not him. Because you're deciding whether Earth committed a naked act of interference or whether Earth accepted breach to stop a legal process from completing the disappearance of a people. The phrase landed, but the cost of her admission landed. 2. She had moved the hearing on a moral ground and structural critique. She had also handed the prosecution what sounded like the core of the case. Salvek pressed the advantage. Earth is confessing vigilantism. No. Earth is confessing that your review windows were designed to close after harm became irreversible. You do not know that. I know what repeated sequence looks like. Salvek took 2 steps toward the center circle, breaking his earlier stillness. Then answer directly. Did Earth command authorize intervention before final council ruling? Yes. Did Earth understand that intervention would violate covenant boundaries? Yes. Did Earth understand that other powers might cite this action in future to justify their own unilateral rescues, annexations, or seizures? Yes. He turned toward the council ring with cold precision. The envoy's own words establish conscious breach of common order in service of unilateral moral judgment. Saren knew many in the chamber were ready to stop there. The danger of precedent did not need ornament. That was why the next move had to be exact. She called for witness chain confirmation. The moderator hesitated, then allowed 3 short submissions. The first came from a neutral port medic stationed in the corridor during the transfer. The medic testified that large sections of the Sylith registry had become inaccessible hours before reclassification notices reached the shelters. The second came from a communications contractor who confirmed that challenge traffic from Sylith councils had been routed into delayed verification channels after status change. The third came from an archive technician who stated under verification oath that once the downgrade activated, restoration requests for prior communal standing would have required recognition codes the Sylith no longer possessed. Salvek attacked witness relevance. He called them peripheral, incomplete, and emotionally suggestive. But the room had already shifted again. The hearing no longer split neatly between law and lawlessness. It had become a decision about which violation the council found easier to live with. At the edge of Saren's display, a quiet note from Lian appeared on her private slate. External feed sentiment had changed. Not entirely in Earth's favor, but neutral populations were beginning to ask the right question. What happens when appeal becomes impossible before appeal is allowed? That was enough. Not enough to win, and not enough to make the room safe. Enough to make the chamber dangerous for the people who had assumed Earth would come. In begging for mercy, the moderator announced a final sequence of evidence before deliberative challenge. Saren knew what that meant. The next block would be the most dangerous of the day. The old powers would stop arguing abstract necessity and start protecting themselves. She was ready for that. What she was not ready for was the sealed packet that arrived under council authorization and flashed red across the prosecution tier. Salvek read it once and did not let his expression move. Then he asked permission to introduce supplemental evidence obtained from transit security. Saren felt the air around her change before the moderator even agreed. The chamber had warmed slowly through the last hour. Now it seemed to tighten again. The packet, when opened, did not show law. It showed the evacuation itself and what Earth had done inside it. The new footage came from corridor drones Earth had failed to capture. It showed human personnel escorting Sylith civilians through maintenance shafts not approved for evacuation traffic. It showed Earth shuttle crews bypassing transit locks. It showed one council security barrier forced open after a control loop freeze. There was no gunfire and no spectacle. It was just enough procedural aggression to transform rescue into unauthorized extraction in the eyes of half the galaxy. Salvek let the images linger. Envoy Vale, were those routes approved? No. Were those barriers opened under council authorization? No. Did Earth crews exploit system disruption to evade transfer control? Yes. He did not need to raise his voice. Then whatever broader argument Earth wishes to make, the immediate fact remains. Your government acted first and asked questions later. Saren answered on the same level. No. We asked questions first, filed challenges first, waited first, warned first, and acted when your timing ensured the answer would come after the people were gone. That line carried. So did the footage. Both truths now sat in the room together. And that was the point where many decent listeners would begin to divide. Some would think Earth had gone too far. Some would think Earth had done the only thing left. The council itself would have to choose which version of order it preferred. The moderator recessed the chamber once more for legal structuring before final argument. Delegates withdrew to consultation bands. Observers flooded private channels, and the public light dimmed to amber. The room had grown louder now, but not looser. Pressure had only changed shape. Saren stepped back from the rail and finally felt fatigue reach her bones. Lien met her in the side corridor again. They hit the extraction footage exactly when sentiment started to tilt, he said. Of course they did. It hurts us. Yes. He hesitated. Do you still plan to say Earth acted intentionally if they force a direct moral question? Saren looked through the glass at the delegates clustering in high arcs over the chamber floor. They already forced it, she said. The only remaining question is whether the Council wants a world where law can erase people more than it fears a government that crossed a line to stop it. Lien held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. There's another packet, he said quietly. From the archive team on Earth. What is it? Beneficiary linkage. Not just corridor concentration. Contract overlap. Insurance cover. Emergency route inheritance. It points to a coordinated interest block. Saren took the slate from him and read fast. Her pulse slowed instead of rising. That was how pressure always worked on her. The closer the room got to collapse, the cleaner her thoughts became. This was the missing bridge. It was not proof that Salvek himself had authored the system. It was proof that the same commercial and institutional actors repeatedly benefited from populations losing standing under emergency downgrade. A broader design and a second antagonist with many faces. She closed the slate. We use it. Lien frowned. If you use it, the hearing stops being about breach and becomes a direct attack on the old charter order. It already is. They will remember. So will everyone else. When the chamber reconvened, Saren returned to the witness circle, feeling the floor beneath her feet as if it were a line carved through history. Behind her stood Earth. Above her sat the Council. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the station and the feeds and the polished wording, the Scythe were waiting to learn whether they would be restored as a people or filed forever as an administrative residue of someone else's emergency. The moderator called the room back to order. Before closing argument, the chamber will hear final submissions on motive, system design, and the proportionality of Earth's conduct. Salvek rose. Then let us finish this honestly. He did not begin with outrage, because that would have been easy to dismiss. He began with history. For centuries, he said, interstellar law has existed to prevent strong states from remaking border regions according to private conscience. Every empire in this chamber's memory once had a story to justify exception. Security, mercy, urgency, civil rescue. The wording changed. The result did not. He let the line settle. Earth asks us to endorse the oldest danger in civilized space. A government decides that procedure is too slow, claims a higher moral necessity, enters a regulated zone, and removes a population already under legal administration. If we permit this because Earth's narrative moves us, then tomorrow another power will do the same under a darker flag. No one in the chamber could dismiss that argument as foolish. Saren did not. It was the strongest case against her, and it deserved to be heard. Salvek continued. Earth has implied that law was used as a weapon, but the record also shows that Earth used forceful timing, covert routing, and unauthorized extraction because it believed its own judgment should outrank common order. That is the core fact, not rhetoric about dignity, not speculative design theories. Earth acted without authority. He turned toward the upper ring. If the Council wishes to review the operation of Addendum 17, let it do so in due course. But do not confuse that policy debate with the clear misconduct before us now. Then he faced Saren again. Order must survive even when outcomes disturb us. If order survives only when all outcomes please us, then no order exists. A murmur of agreement moved through several tiers. The room was tired now. That made every sentence heavier. The moderator nodded to her. Saren rested both hands on the rail and began where she had always intended to begin. Director Salvek is right about one thing, she said. Civilization cannot survive if every state crosses boundaries whenever it feels righteous. The chamber listened more closely because she had granted the premise. That is why Earth did not act at first. Earth filed. Earth warned. Earth sought review. Earth requested injunction. Earth documented timing. Earth waited while the Scythe were reclassified in pieces. She brought the delay sequence back into view, but only briefly. The chamber had already seen it. This time she used it not to prove facts, but to anchor the path. By the time lawful review could arrive, the claimant population would have ceased to exist in law as a people. That is not ordinary delay. That is a design in which timing decides substance. She lifted the new slate Lien had given her. And because the chamber has now heard repeated suggestions that Earth is projecting motive where only complexity exists, Earth will submit the beneficiary linkage pattern. The display changed. This one was harder to absorb emotionally and therefore more dangerous politically. Contract webs crossed the air like a steel nest. Emergency route inheritances, labor allocation bonds, insurance premium recalculations, long-tail maintenance leases, and stabilization mandates converted into commercial rights. Saren kept her explanation spare. These records do not show a single villain. They show a recurring group of beneficiaries whenever dependent civilizations lose standing under emergency downgrade near critical transport and extraction corridors. She highlighted one set. Hadran Transit receives expanded custodial rights. Another. Oronine affiliates receive labor continuity guarantees. Another. Insurance consortia linked to 3 charter blocks receive reduced risk exposure once populations are moved from protected civic status to dependent administration. Another. And in 14 of the last 23 major downgrade events, the same legislative advisors supported the legal revisions that made challenge harder during active transfer. The chamber's silence became harder now. Not shock, but calculation. Some delegates had stopped pretending this was only about one breach. A delegate from the River Senate asked the question that mattered most. The River Senate represented a cautious neutral bloc that feared concentrated power, but hated instability just as much. Envoy Vale, are you alleging collusion? Saren answered precisely. I am alleging structural convergence, so persistent that calling it coincidence becomes less credible than calling it design. Salvek moved at once. Convergence is not corruption. Perhaps not, Saren said, but a legal architecture that consistently benefits the same strong actors while weak peoples lose standing at their moment of maximum vulnerability deserves more than procedural deference. The Hadran speaker requested reply, but the moderator denied immediate interruption. That denial alone revealed how far the chamber had shifted. Earlier they had controlled rhythm. Now rhythm was slipping. Saren took the opening. I'm not asking the council to bless unilateral rescue as a general doctrine. Earth is not here to teach the galaxy how to ignore law. Earth is here because this chamber is deciding something more specific and more dangerous. Can law remain legitimate when it allows a people to be downgraded out of existence while their records are fragmented, their councils are dispersed, and their appeals are delayed until they no longer exist as a claimant? Every word mattered. It had to be one sentence a tired listener could still hold. She continued before anyone could cut the thread. If the answer is yes, then Earth breached an order already hollow at the center. If the answer is no, then this chamber must admit the process Earth interrupted cannot be treated as ordinary administration. Salvek finally broke some of his restraint. That is blackmail by moral framing. Saren turned to him. No, it is what your own evidence has produced. You showed the breach. I showed what the breach interrupted. The moderator asked the chamber for focused response on proportionality. Several delegates signaled. The first came from a frontier republic often hostile to Earth. The Earth action still risks contagion. Other states may copy this justification. Saren answered him directly. They might, which is why the council should do the harder thing instead of the easier one. Repair the process that created the justification. The second came from Meridian. If the chamber accepts your critique, do you ask for total invalidation of emergency downgrade law? No, Saren said. I ask for immediate suspension of downgrade execution during active dispersal, mandatory preservation of prior identity records, and independent review before collective status loss can become final. The answer mattered because it showed she was not trying to destroy emergency management entirely. She was drawing a line any reasonable listener could understand. Stabilize first. Decide whether a people still exists after you can hear them speak. A third delegate from the old charter line leaned forward with visible impatience. And what of Earth's conduct? Do you ask us to excuse it? Saren looked up into the ring, where power sat beneath neutral light, and decided that this was the moment for the cleanest truth she had. No, she said. I ask you to judge it accurately. The room held. Earth knowingly violated covenant boundaries. No one moved. Earth knowingly interfered with a live transfer corridor. Stillness. Earth knowingly removed persons whom council authority had already reassigned. A few delegates shifted, hearing vindication approach. Then Saren finished. Earth also knew that if it obeyed perfectly, the people in that corridor would lose the legal identity required to exist as a people before any meaningful review arrived. The chamber exhaled as one body. I'm not asking for innocence, Saren said. I'm asking whether obedience was supposed to complete the harm. That sentence crossed the room like wire under tension. The Hadran speaker managed to secure speaking permission at last. With respect to the envoy's eloquence, civilizations cannot be governed on the basis of singular moral panic. Every emergency measure looks cruel when isolated from the system it saves. Saren nodded. Then let us stay with systems. A system that cannot preserve itself without waiting for weaker peoples to become legally voiceless is not stable. It is merely insulated. The Oronine representative was sharper. Spoken like a world new enough to mistake complexity for malice. Saren turned toward the voice. No, spoken like a world still young enough to remember that paperwork can kill without ever using a weapon. That line traveled farther than she intended. She saw it hit the observer tiers and bounce outward into the public streams. Good. Let travel. The moderator called for final challenge from Salvek. He rose more slowly now, as if the day had added years to him. Envoy Vale keeps returning to one core emotional idea, that people were made invisible. But law does not run on emotion. It runs on categories. Populations fragment. Governance fails. Responsibilities transfer. The council cannot keep every identity frozen in ideal form while entire sectors burn. He looked not at her, but at the delegates. If you validate Earth's reasoning, you teach every ambitious power that it may define another authority's law as harmful and intervene before review. Whatever flaws may exist in our system, we repair them through order, not by rewarding breach. Saren accepted the force of it. Then she answered from the narrowest place. I'm not asking you to reward breach. I am asking you not to hide behind breach to avoid seeing the flaw that made breach plausible. Salvek's eyes narrowed. Plausible to whom? Earth. To anyone who still believes a displaced people should not lose their right to remain a people before they can be heard. At last, the moderator signaled the end of submissions. The chamber entered closed deliberation bands, though public transmission remained active for procedural announcements. Delegates withdrew into concentric consultation fields above the floor. Their words did not carry clearly, but their alignments did. Saren could read them from movement alone. The punishment block formed first. Old charter powers, route administrators, and commercial sovereignties wanted a ruling strong enough to protect precedent, even if some review followed later. The preservation block formed second. They were not Earth's friends, but those who feared what the hearing had already exposed. They wanted to contain scandal, suspend the process, and avoid making Earth a martyr. The third block was the only uncertain one. Border states, maritime unions, small republics, and neutral auditors genuinely feared both kinds of collapse. A lawless rescue doctrine on one side, a law that could erase peoples on the other. Those were the votes that mattered. While the chamber consulted, Saren stepped back with Lien into the shadow of the witness circle. Public cameras still held them in frame, but the hall's broad acoustics masked low speech. Where do you place it? He asked. Too close, she said. Against us. Against everyone. A message flared on his slate. He read it once and passed it over. External sentiment from smaller systems had shifted sharply in the last 20 minutes. Not toward Earth as a hero, but toward fear. Fear that they too could vanish in law if displacement and administrative downgrades collided at the wrong time. Saren handed the slate back. They feel the floor moving. Will that change the vote? It might change what the undecideds are afraid of. She watched Salvek across the chamber, speaking in low tones with two charter delegates and the Hadran representative. He still stood straight and composed, but his gestures were smaller now, tighter. He had come to secure a clean judgment. Instead, he had been forced to defend a legal culture in front of an audience that had started asking basic questions. Lian glanced at him too. Do you think he believes any of this? He asked. Saren considered. He believes order is a fragile bridge over chaos. He also believes the bridge matters more than the villages under its shadow. And the others? Some believe that. Some believe profit. Some stopped noticing the difference. The deliberation bands brightened and dimmed, then reformed, split, and rejoined. Hours passed in that kind of motion, though the station clocks counted them more precisely. For listeners back on Earth and across the galaxy, the waiting itself became part of the story. Not because waiting is dramatic by itself, but because everyone knew the chamber was no longer choosing a sentence for Earth alone. It was choosing what kind of shame it could survive. At last the moderator returned to central light. All delegates resumed formal position, and the chamber sealed for ruling. Saren felt her pulse slow, not speed. She had lived long enough to know that fear often peaked before the deciding moment. Once the moment arrived, there was only structure. The moderator spoke. The Council has reached provisional judgment in the matter of Earth's intervention in the Aston Reach transfer corridor. The first clause hit exactly as expected. The Chamber finds that the Earth Accord knowingly violated boundary procedure under the Emergency Border Covenant. There it was, recorded, public, and impossible to soften. The second clause followed. The Chamber does not find sufficient basis at this stage to characterize Earth's conduct as territorial seizure, hostile annexation, or predatory extraction. A ripple crossed the Chamber. It was not exoneration, but it was not the deeper condemnation Salvek had wanted. The moderator continued. Given the evidence presented concerning the operation of Addendum 17 and related downgrade procedures during active dispersal, the Council orders immediate suspension of collective status loss under said procedures where affected populations are in fragmented transit conditions. This time the reaction was sharper. Several delegates objected before the rail struck for order. The moderator did not pause. The Council further orders preservation of all pre-existing civil identity records relevant to the Sylif community belt and establishes independent review of their collective continuity under neutral audit supervision. Pending that review, no final dependent labor administration status shall attach. Lian let out a breath behind Saren, so slowly she barely heard it. The moderator looked toward Earth. On the matter of consequence, the Earth Accord will receive formal censure for procedural breach and temporary review constraints on future unilateral corridor interventions. However, no continuing sanctions regime or standing external control measure is imposed at this time. That was the compromise. Earth would pay, publicly and officially, but would not be put under the boot Salvek's coalition had prepared. The moderator's voice remained steady. The Council additionally opens charter review into the design, revision history, and beneficiary effects of emergency downgrade law, where evidence suggests structural risk of dispossessive application. This last clause mattered most in the long run and least in the immediate headlines. Most audiences would hear only the surface. Earth censured, procedure suspended, review opened. Saren heard the deeper truth. The machine had not been destroyed, but it had been forced to stop mid-motion with the galaxy watching. Salvek rose to object on preservation grounds, but the moderator denied him. The ruling had been entered. The public light flared full white again. The hearing was over. For one suspended second, no one moved. Then the chamber broke into the orderly chaos of aftermath. Delegates sent messages. Observers stood. Staff crossed the floor with sealed notices. Commentators rushed to frame the result before someone else did it for them. Saren remained still at the rail. Censured, constrained, not crushed. The Sylif were not yet restored, but they were no longer legally gone. It was enough to make the room feel heavier than victory should. Lien came to her side with the first official summary packet. His face had the strange, exhausted brightness of someone who had survived something too tense to celebrate. "We kept the corridor review from becoming a control regime," he said. "Yes. And the downgrade freeze is real. Yes. And the review on design will become a war of its own." He gave a humorless laugh. "I thought you might say that." Across the chamber, the Hadran representative was already surrounded by advisors. The Oronine speaker had gone pale with contained anger. Smaller delegations looked shaken in a different way, as if they had just learned a rule they had always lived under but never fully seen. Salvek approached at last. Lien stiffened, but Saren lifted one hand very slightly. "Let him come." He stopped at a proper distance, public enough to prevent rashness. "You have damaged more than you know," he said. Saren looked at him evenly. "That assumes the damage was hidden." He studied her face. "You think this helps weak peoples. It helps them remain visible long enough to speak. It will also slow emergency response across unstable sectors. Then perhaps those sectors deserved better law." His jaw set. "You have made future interventions more likely." She answered the way she had to. "No, your system did that. I only made the cost public." For the first time all day, something like fatigue crossed his features. "You are still censured," he said. "Yes. And Earth will remember the constraints attached to that censure." "Of course." He inclined his head once, not in respect exactly, but in recognition that the day had ended and neither of them would fully own its meaning. Then he turned away. Lien waited until Salvek was beyond easy hearing. "Do you think he will come after us through review channels?" "Not him alone," Saren said. "Everyone who lost comfort today will." They left the chamber through the same side corridor, but nothing in it felt the same now. Hours earlier, Earth had walked in as a defendant expected to plead for lenience. Now Earth walked out carrying official blame and having forced one of the oldest legal habits in the Council into open scrutiny. At the security bridge, Saren received the first direct transmission from Earth Command. It was concise, almost brutally so. Censure acceptable. Strategic constraints manageable. Civil review outcome priority. Standby for follow-on negotiations. That was Earth in one note. No sentiment and no triumph. Just cost accounting with moral weight folded inside. She smiled anyway, briefly. By the time she reached the delegation suite, the secondary consequences had already begun. 3 scheduled appearances on neutral legal forums had been revoked. 2 border compacts had requested review of joint oversight protocols with Earth. A charter advisory board had circulated a memo calling Earth's argument destabilizing moral exceptionalism. Another file arrived seconds later from a Sylith provisional contact network restored under emergency preservation order. It was not polished. It was not even a formal statement. It was just a line of raw archived names beginning to repopulate a civic registry that had been hours from extinction. Saren opened the file and read. Name after name after name. No poetry and no speech. No banners. Just restored existence. Lien stood in the doorway and did not interrupt. After a while he asked, "Was it worth the censure?" Saren closed the slate and looked out at Iridian Prime, turning beyond the glass. "Ask me again in 5 years. And now." She thought of the hearing chamber, of Salvek's warning, of the delegates who had voted with fear in one hand and self-protection in the other. She thought of the Galactic Councils scattered and half erased, now given one narrow path back into recognized life. Now, she said, it was necessary. He leaned against the door frame, tired enough to forget formality. "The feed analysts are saying you never defended Earth." "I did defend Earth. Not the way they mean." "No," she said, "not the way they mean." Because Earth had not come to prove itself pure. Purity was a luxury for worlds not yet entangled in power. Earth had come to prove something smaller and more expensive. That it was still willing, sometimes, to accept blame rather than let procedure finish a quiet crime. A priority signal came in from the Neutral Audit Office. Saren opened it at once. Preliminary restoration channels for the Sylith would begin within 12 hours. Independent civic continuity review would follow. Representatives from affected clusters would be given protected speaking status during reconstruction hearings. Protected speaking status. A simple phrase, enough to change futures. Lien let out another long breath. They get to speak. Yes. He shook his head as if the fact still surprised him. For a while there, I thought the chamber would take the easier road. It did, Saren said. He frowned. She explained. It censured us. That was not easy. It was easier than admitting innocence. Hard enough to preserve order. Soft enough to preserve legitimacy. Each name was short. Each one had almost vanished between law and transit, between delay and classification, between what the council called administration and what the weak experienced as disappearance. Lien stood beside the window. Neither of them spoke for a long time. When the list ended, the transmission closed with one sentence. We remain present for review. Saren shut her eyes, then opened them again. That was all. Not victory, not safety, only presence. In the days ahead, commentators would reduce the hearing to slogans. Earth censured, council embarrassed, reform opened, precedent threatened. But those were only the outer labels. The thing that mattered had happened in a smaller register. A people that had been sliding toward legal absence had held long enough to say, in a formal language of interstellar order, that they were still there. Saren stood by the glass and watched the lights of Iridian Prime drift under the station shadow. Humanity, she thought, was not difficult because it was stronger than every old power. It was difficult because sometimes it refused the comfort of staying clean while the machinery ran. Sometimes it stepped into the part of history where every available choice carried blame, and it chose the blame it could live with. That did not make Earth noble in any simple sense. It did not erase the damage of breach, the risk of future misuse, or the truth that some governments would learn the wrong lesson for what had happened. It only meant that on this day, in this chamber, Earth had not allowed law to finish speaking after the people inside it had been denied a voice. Another message entered Saren's queue. It was not official and carried no seal. There was no authority marker, only a line routed through 3 neutral relays from an address that would vanish after opening. It contained one sentence. This will not end at review. She read it twice, then archived it under expected retaliation. Lien noticed her expression. Problem. Forecast, she said. From whom? Enough of them. He rubbed one hand over his face. So we begin again. We always do. The station lights dimmed towards cycle rest. Far below, the planet turned. Far beyond, corridors carried freight, refugees, contracts, medicine, rumors, and every old lie that kept large systems comfortable. Somewhere among them, the Sylith were counting themselves back into existence. Saren picked up the case slate she had carried into the chamber that morning. It was scuffed now along one edge, the kind of damage nobody noticed unless they had held the object all day under pressure. She set it down again and looked once more at the darkening curve of Iridian Prime. The Council had censured Earth. The old powers would regroup. The law would be fought over in 100 rooms where cameras never entered. And still, when the names were read, they were read as the names of a people. That was not enough to end anything, but it was enough to keep the galaxy from pretending nothing had happened. If law can be used to erase the weak, then courage begins with the ones willing to stand in the way. Saren Vale did not leave that chamber with a clean victory. She left with something harder and far more human. She left knowing that sometimes the cost of doing what is right is being blamed by the very system you refuse to let win. But because she stood there, because Earth refused to look away, an entire people were able to say the words no empire should ever silence. We are still here.